Good evening, this is host Hale, and you are watching Case 0360, case number 12. Tonight's investigation is one that begins with an ordinary morning, a routine school drop-off, and ends in a question that shook an entire community. How does someone simply vanish in broad daylight after doing everything right? On the morning of January 3rd, 2024, Kayla Atwood, a mother of 4, started her day like countless other parents. There was nothing unusual reported by those closest to her. No warning signs that stood out in hindsight. She woke up early, prepared her children for the day, and followed her usual routine. Her 2 youngest children were dropped off at their daycare facility just after the morning rush had begun to settle. Cameras outside the building confirmed her arrival, her brief interactions, and then her departure. After that moment, Kayla Atwood was never seen returning to collect her children. At first, no one panicked. Life is busy, schedules shift, plans change. But as the hours passed and then stretched into the evening, concern began to grow. Calls were made, messages went unanswered. Her phone rang, but there was no response. By nightfall, a mother who had always maintained communication with her children's caregivers had gone completely silent. The initial missing person report triggered what would soon become a complex and emotionally charged investigation. Officers began with the most critical step, reconstructing her last known movements. The daycare visit was the starting point, a fixed anchor in time. Surveillance footage confirmed she had arrived alone, dropped off her children, and left without any visible distress. There were no signs of an argument, no visible confrontation, nothing that immediately suggested danger. From there, investigators expanded outward. Neighbors were interviewed. They described Kayla as a responsible, devoted mother who maintained a structured daily life. She was not known to disappear without notice. Her routine was consistent. That consistency, investigators noted, made her sudden disappearance even more alarming. Attention then shifted to her communications. Phone records showed activity earlier that morning, but a sudden cutoff after a certain point. No outgoing messages, no further location updates, no digital footprint that could clearly indicate where she went next. In today's world, where most movements leave a trace, this absence became one of the first major red flags. Investigators began mapping her social connections. Friends, acquaintances, recent contacts. Among these was a relatively new individual in her life, someone she had reportedly met not long before the disappearance. At first, this detail did not immediately raise suspicion. People meet new friends, new neighbors, new connections all the time. But as detectives dug deeper, they began to notice inconsistencies in timelines and statements that did not align perfectly. The investigation then moved into a more structured phase. Detectives reviewed traffic cameras along possible routes she may have taken after leaving the daycare. They examined intersections, parking lots, and public surveillance systems. Slowly, a fragmented picture began to form. It was not yet complete, but it suggested that Kayla's movements after the daycare were not random. There appeared to be direction, a pattern that pointed away from routine errands and toward a specific destination or meeting. As pressure increased, investigators conducted more detailed interviews with people who had last seen her. Some recalled brief conversations, others mentioned casual encounters, but one particular interaction stood out. A ride-sharing connection, described as friendly at first, but later re-examined under a more critical lens. The timeline of this interaction became central to the case. It suggested that Kayla may not have been alone for part of her final known journey. As detectives worked through this lead, digital forensics teams began analyzing location data. Even partial signals from mobile networks can reveal movement patterns, and in this case, they did. While not perfectly precise, the data suggested that her phone had traveled through a series of locations that did not match her usual routes. This deviation was significant. It indicated either voluntary travel to unfamiliar areas or movement under circumstances that were not entirely within her control. At this stage of the investigation, the tone shifted. What began as a missing person case started to lean towards something far more serious. Authorities began treating it as a potential criminal investigation. Surveillance teams expanded their scope. Search efforts intensified. Community awareness grew, and concern turned into urgency. Then came a breakthrough, though not immediately understood as one at the time. A piece of surveillance footage, initially reviewed as part of a broader sweep, captured a vehicle that matched a description linked to the new person in her circle. The footage was grainy, incomplete in detail, but it provided a directional clue. It placed the vehicle in a location that corresponded with the later stage of Kayla's known timeline. Investigators followed this thread carefully. They examined ownership records, travel patterns, and any available digital traces associated with the vehicle. What emerged was a more complex web of interactions than initially expected: multiple contact points, overlapping timelines, and inconsistent explanations provided by individuals connected to the case. As interviews continued, inconsistencies became more difficult to ignore. Statements that were initially considered minor discrepancies began to form a pattern. Times did not match. Locations were described differently by different people. Memory gaps appeared in critical moments. For experienced investigators, these inconsistencies often signal either confusion under stress or deliberate concealment. Meanwhile, search operations continued in areas identified through phone data and witness accounts. These searches were methodical, covering rural stretches, quiet roads, and less trafficked zones. Volunteers joined authorities, hoping for answers, hoping for closure. The emotional weight of the case was growing not just for law enforcement, but for the community as well. As days passed, the investigation reached a critical turning point. Digital evidence, combined with surveillance analysis and interview patterns, narrowed focus onto a primary suspect. This individual had been connected to Kayla through recent interactions and had been present in key segments of the reconstructed timeline. While suspicion alone is never enough for an arrest, the accumulation of evidence began to form a coherent narrative that could not be ignored. Authorities moved carefully. Every detail had to be verified. Every piece of evidence had to withstand scrutiny. Investigators cross-checked timestamps, communication logs, and physical location data. The goal was not only to identify a suspect, but to ensure that any conclusion drawn would hold up in court. When the arrest finally occurred, it sent shockwaves through those following the case. The individual taken into custody was not someone widely known for prior offenses, which made the development even more unexpected for many. However, investigators emphasized that the arrest was based on a combination of digital evidence, witness statements, and reconstructed timelines that placed the individual in critical proximity to Kayla during her final known movements. Interviews with the suspect introduced a new layer of complexity. Initial statements were cautious, limited, and at times vague. Investigators noted reluctance to provide clear explanations for specific time periods. As questioning continued, contradictions emerged between earlier statements and newly presented evidence. This is often a pivotal moment in investigations, where narrative control begins to shift toward documented fact rather than verbal account. As the case progressed through legal channels, authorities continued working to reconstruct Kayla Atwood's final hours. Every detail mattered. Every timestamp, every movement, every interaction was analyzed to ensure clarity. For the family, however, the process was not about technical precision. It was about understanding what happened and why someone who left home that morning never returned. Community response to the case was intense. Vigils were held. Social media discussions grew rapidly. People tried to piece together theories, but investigators repeatedly emphasized the importance of verified evidence over speculation. In cases like this, misinformation can spread quickly, complicating already sensitive investigations. As the case file expanded, it became clear that Kayla's disappearance was not the result of random chance. It was tied to a series of interactions and decisions that, when viewed together, formed a tragic sequence of events. Each step in her final journey was now being carefully documented, not only to understand what happened, but to ensure accountability. For those closest to her, however, no amount of investigation could replace what was lost. Kayla Atwood was not just a name in a file. She was a mother, a presence in her children's lives, a part of a family that now faced a permanent absence. In many true crime investigations, answers come slowly, and sometimes not fully at all. But what remains essential is the pursuit of truth. Case 0360 continues to follow developments in this investigation, ensuring that every new detail is examined with care and responsibility. As we close tonight's report, we are reminded that behind every case file, there is a human story, a morning that began like any other, a routine that should have ended safely, and a series of moments that changed everything. This is host Haley, and this was case number 12 on case 0360.